All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I think we will give it another minute or two for additional attendees to join the webinar. It looks like we have a lot of people hopping on right now. My name is Jessica Coleman, and I'm going to be giving this presentation today. We are going to open up, however, with a few words from Adrienne Janes of INCOG. But yeah, thank you all for joining us today. We'll get started here momentarily. Okay, great. It looks like we have a good number of participants already. So Adrienne, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Jessa. Hello everyone, and welcome to our second Oklahoma CPACE webinar. On behalf of INCOG and PACE Financial Servicing, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Adrienne Janes. I'm the Energy Programs Coordinator at INCOG, and I'm joined by Nancy Graham, our Air Quality Program Manager. And INCOG is facilitating this webinar series as well as the development of the CPACE program for Oklahoma when we're planning a launch later this fall of the program. Before we get today's webinar going, I want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on INCOG's website and emailed out probably next week or later this week to everyone who registered. Second, our presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor for questions and answers. And today we have three ways you can ask questions. The first is you can type your question into the Q&A section, or you can enter your question into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and be called on when we get to the Q&A section, and then the host will unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. Just note we are going to wait until after the presentation to answer all the questions. And finally, as a side note, today for all the Oklahomans on the call is Election Day, so if you haven't voted yet, to do that, get to your polling place after the webinar. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jessa Coleman, Senior Manager at PACE Financial Servicing, for our presentation today. Thank you, Jessa.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrienne. All right, well, for those of you who weren't able to join our first webinar, this is the second webinar in a series of three that we are sharing about developing the Oklahoma CPACE program. So the first webinar that we shared was more of an introduction to Oklahoma CPACE, a 101 type presentation. We went into a lot of detail about the benefits of CPACE and how the actual transaction structure works. That is available as a recording along with the slides on INCOG's website, like Adrienne just mentioned. And so if you weren't able to join that, do feel free to look up that information later. That being the case, this program is going to focus more on the actual process of developing the Oklahoma CPACE program. We're going to talk about where in this development process we are hoping to solicit feedback from you all, the public, and other stakeholders in the program. And I will give here a brief fundamentals of CPACE just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So if you did join our 101 webinar, feel free to take 10 minutes to grab your coffee or your breakfast. But I'll just jump right in. All right, so INCOG is a voluntary association of local and tribal governments in the Tulsa region. They're one of the 11 councils of government in the state of Oklahoma, and they support planning and coordination services for a number of different regional challenges, including economic development, environmental quality, and energy programs. And so, as is going to become very, very clear shortly here, designing a CPACE program for the state of Oklahoma fits very squarely into that mission, which is why INCOG has stepped forward and volunteered to take this. this burden. There is some effort involved upon themselves and to design this program for the counties of Oklahoma and its property owners. Now, I work for a company called Pace Financial Servicing, or PFS. We help design, implement, and administer CPACE programs nationwide. We currently administer programs in the states of Maryland and Virginia. INCOG has hired us as essentially a technical expert, a consultant in supporting them in designing a program for a CPACE program for Oklahomans. And we also currently are working on designing a program in Alaska. So we've worked on a number of additional programs as well, but we have a pretty solid foundation as both an administrator and a design consultant. And so the value that we are hoping to bring here is that we really understand and recognize how the recommendations that we make will translate into the day-to-day operations of this program on the ground. So a brief overview of the fundamentals of CPACE financing for those who are completely, who don't know yet. But CPACE stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. It is a government policy that states that energy efficiency, energy generation, water conservation, and lately, even resiliency projects on commercial buildings are a public benefit. And the way that it implements this policy is that the state will pass enabling legislation allowing for CPACE within that state that has already taken place here in Oklahoma. Local governments must then establish a CPACE program within their own jurisdiction by passing an enabling resolution. And once those two legislative pieces have taken place, then it is possible for building owners to access private capital to finance these energy, water, and resiliency related improvements on their property. And like other public benefit assessments, CPACE projects are secured by the building that they benefit through a special assessment. So that's why the state and local governments are involved here. We are facilitating a market that will allow for private capital providers to provide financing to these projects. And then that financing is going to be secured by a corresponding assessment on the property. Now, CPACE is available across the United States. It's been around for about a decade as a policy, and there are about 37 states plus DC that in the country now have enabling legislation allowing for CPACE financing, and about 22 states plus Washington, DC have actual active programs. Oklahoma is one of those states that has enabling legislation, and we're trying to move it into this green box where we're trying to help set up an actual active program. So just a final brief note on how these project transactions work. Once a CPACE program has been established, then property owners are able to apply for CPACE financing, which will allow them to fund up to 100% of all hard and soft costs of an eligible project. The project is underwritten by private capital providers. As we already discussed, the county will levy a corresponding assessment on that property, and then qualified contractors will install the project. The property owner will be billed concurrent with property taxes each year. However, they will receive that bill directly from the capital provider. And if the property owner were to sell this property, or if the property were to transfer to a new owner for any other reason before the assessment is fully repaid, just like with any other assessment, the outstanding balance and payment schedule is going to transfer to the new owner. So that's one of the aspects that sets CPACE apart from traditional commercial financing. Because of this unique structure, the fact that the financing is being provided by private capital providers, but being secured through a assessment on the property. These capital providers are able to offer some very interesting terms and conditions of the financing that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to offer. So this financing is 100% upfront financing, as we said, which means there's going to be no money down ever required when accessing this financing. The repayment terms are extensive. In Oklahoma, they can last up to 30 years. That's not surprisingly going to decrease the annual payment amount, which very frequently will make this financing a more attractive offer to a number of potential borrowers. The interest rates are competitive. They are fixed over the entire term of the repayment cycle. And what all of this means is that because we're investing in projects that are intended to improve the energy and water efficiency of the building, thereby saving money on annual operating expenses, these projects are frequently designed to be cash flow positive from day one. And what that really means here is that for an ideal project scenario, a property owner is accessing 100% of the financing required for a given project. Let's say it's replacing an HVAC system and installing LED lighting. That property owner is not required to front any of the cost of that project out of their own pocket. That project is resulting in annual operating expenses on a yearly basis. Annual operating savings on the expenses on a yearly basis, that is. And because we are extending this repayment period of the financing over a 30-year term, then that payment is significantly decreased, resulting in a scenario whereby the savings each year off of those operating expenses will be greater than the actual payment of the PACE assessment that is required each year. And that is the ideal project scenario where you end up with a property owner being cash flow positive from the very first day that they access financing. Now, there are a number of other benefits that apply to CPACE financing that make this attractive even if the project is not designed to be cash flow positive. One of those is that this financing is secured by the property, as we've discussed, not by any sort of owner guarantee or credit score. What that means is that non-traditional borrowers may be able to access CPACE financing, whereas they might struggle to access a traditional bank loan. As we stated before, the obligation transfers with ownership of the building. So this is also a very attractive financing tool for property developers who intend on improving a property's value and then selling it after 3 or 4 or 5 years. And this is also a great financial tool when there are triple net lease scenarios between landlords and tenants. Again, because this is legally an assessment obligation, the annual payment can actually be passed through to the tenants of a property the same way they would pass through other taxes and special assessments. What that means is that the tenants of the building are the ones who are both benefiting from the building improvements in terms of their physical comfort in the building, and they're also the ones that are paying those for those improvements. So it addresses this split incentive challenge between tenants and landlords when it comes to improving these properties. All right, so that's our basic fundamentals of CPACE. We're all on the same page now. And like I said, this is where the point in our discussion where we're going to really address some very different topics than what we addressed on the first webinar. We're going to delve into the design process for developing the Oklahoma CPACE program. We're going to talk about all of the documents that we're working on as part of this program, and the stakeholders and other actors that are involved. So, the Oklahoma CPACE program is an initiative to develop a CPACE program administrative platform that will work statewide for any county choosing to establish a program. There are 3 parts to the Oklahoma CPACE program. The first step is to design the program. The second step is to implement the program. And the third step is to administer the program. Right now, we're in the program design phase. What that means is that we are developing the documents and the underlying operating structure for both the program and individual transactions that any county that wishes to establish a CPACE program will be able to adopt to use themselves. So these documents are going to be templatized with the intention that they suit the needs of every county in the state. Now, the first thing that we did was work on a legislative amendment to the state statute. The state enabling statute in Oklahoma has in fact existed for several years, but it needed some significant tweaks to the language in order to perfect it, to make this a more easily scalable program. Some of those changes were clarifying the role of the county in the program and defining the collection and enforcement methodology for these assessments. Now, that amendment has already been passed. So we're very happy to share that we were able to, that the governor signed this amendment to the state statute, I believe in May, earlier mid-May. So that allows us to proceed with these next aspects of developing the program. Therefore, the next step with design is, and this happens concurrently, we're drafting the statutory documents that will be used as part of this program, and we're drafting the program documents. Now, the statutory documents include an enabling resolution that each county will be able to pass in order to adopt this administrative platform. And the second document is an assessment contract. The assessment contract is a transactional document that will be executed by the county, the borrower, and the capital provider in the case of every single individual CPACE transaction. So as part of our effort to develop this administrative framework, we are, with INCOG, creating those documents for counties so that they don't need to create those documents themselves. Now, the program documents are the documents that most of the property owners and developers and the contractors are going to be interested in, those stakeholders in the program. The program documents comprise a guidance manual, an application checklist, which in and of itself is going to include several documents, such as a lender consent form. Now, the guidance manual is a manual that will be published, and we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail later in this presentation, that will describe both the eligibility requirements of the program as well as the application process to apply for CPACE financing for an individual PACE transaction. And so that guidance manual in and of itself is going to include the application checklist, as well as all of the other documents that will be required components of any application package that needs to be submitted to apply for CPACE financing. And again, that's something else we're going to touch in more detail later in this presentation. So this is the design element of developing the Oklahoma CPACE program. The next step is implementing the program. Implementing the program involves reaching out to local governments about adopting the Oklahoma CPACE program and supporting them in passing this standard resolution that we're designing in order to set up the CPACE program within their jurisdiction. We've already started having conversations with some of the counties that have expressed interest over adopting this program administrative platform, and I encourage any other representatives of local government that are on this call to reach out to Adrienne James or Nancy Graham at INCOG or myself if you're interested in talking to us more about what that process looks like. We are going to have a specific webinar targeted at local governments in another couple of weeks. And again, we'll share details at the very end of this presentation on that. And then the third part of the Oklahoma CPACE program, of course, is administration. So there's a very heavy lift involved in designing the program up front, but then once the program has been implemented, it should be very, very straightforward for counties or their agents to administer the program on in their day-to-day operations. And what that involves is reviewing applications for CPACE financing and approving them, facilitating the closing of assessment contracts and the recording of those documents in the land records, registering capital providers and contractors with the program, and of course your general ongoing outreach and marketing about the program. So in developing this program administrative platform, there is a particular set of tenets that we are adhering to. As I stated before, the entire intent of this program is to be able to be easily adopted by any county and to suit the needs of every county. In order to achieve both of those goals, there are three primary tenets that we need to adhere to that have demonstrated themselves in other states as helping us achieve this goal. The first is that the program should be low cost and it should be simple. If it is a simple program to administer and follow, then it will be easier for counties to adopt the program. Additionally, if it is, and for other stakeholders to operate in the program. If it is a low cost program, that will incentivize further participation in the program, which of course is one of the goals that we're working towards. These programs result in economic development for local communities, as well as in improving the built environment for local communities. So we want to encourage as much participation as possible, and keeping the program low cost and simple to use is part of that. We also intend for this to be an open market program. This being an open market program means that any capital provider is able to provide financing. Any qualified contractor is able to participate in installing these projects. And when we keep the market open, we catalyze innovation and promote growth through the participation of these many competing capital providers and contractors. And again, the competition will help us keep program costs low and transaction costs low. And then the final tenet is for this to be standard. One of the most one of the most challenging aspects in establishing a CPACE program is that a CPACE as a public policy is a function of local law. However, CPACE through the policy creates a market, and a standardized market is the market that will encourage the greatest investment, and by making it simple and straightforward for the stakeholders in that market to understand the rules of the market. So if I can say this a bit more clearly, if 5 counties in Oklahoma were to stand up a CPACE program, but all of those counties had different requirements around how projects were eligible for financing within their program, then that would make it very, very difficult for capital providers and contractors and property owners who do business in more than one county in the state to use CPACE for their business or for their property. So enabling a set and administrative platform that is standardized enough that it can be used by every county and suit the needs of every county means that we can have all counties adopting a platform that will be the same, that will be uniform statewide, and therefore we have a statewide market as opposed to many, many county-specific markets, which would prohibit the investment of private capital. So there's 3 documents, 3 key documents that I would like to talk about now. The first document is the resolution. As we've stated, the CPACE statute at the state level essentially authorizes CPACE within the state and clarifies the role of the county in this program. But then each county needs to pass a resolution describing precisely in more detail how the program is going to work within their jurisdiction. So the resolution that we are designing will enable CPACE within that county's jurisdiction where the resolution has been passed. It will authorize the county to hire a third-party administrator or servicer as necessary to service the program so that the county has the option to offload the administration of the program so that they don't have to dedicate their own resources in man hours and in funding to do that. It will define the status of CPACE as an assessment within the county. It will define the role of the county in the operations of the program, which is very limited. And it will further define eligible improvements. Then we have the assessment contract. Now, the assessment contract is, as I said before, a tri-party agreement between the county, the property owner, and the capital provider. This is the document that really makes CPACE and differentiates it from other forms of commercial financing. Just like with any other private loan that a property owner wished to access, the property owner or borrower in this case and the capital provider will agree upon private loan terms within a separate financing agreement. However, as part of the CPACE program, they will also be required alongside the county to execute this assessment contract. And this assessment contract describes a few key points. In the assessment contract, the property owner voluntarily agrees to the levy of the assessment by the county. They also agree to pay the assessment payments directly to the capital provider rather than through their tax bill as they would pay other tax assessments. This document will therefore include the CPACE assessment payment schedule so that all of the parties understand what payments are due when. And it will describe the repayment and enforcement mechanisms of the CPACE assessment. This document is the document that will be recorded in the land records of the county, evidencing the assessment on the property. Okay, and then the other document that I'd like to discuss here is the guidance manual. And the guidance manual is going to, like I said previously, clarify the eligibility of properties and improvements. It's going to provide the application checklist and procedures, and it will include other template forms that will be, whose usage will be required as part of that application package. We have some more slides about the guidance manual and further in this presentation, but the way therefore to really think about establishing the design of a CPACE program is that first you have the state statute that is the broadest definition of the program. Then each individual county will pass a resolution which further defines what has been defined already in the state statute. And then the counties will adopt this guidance manual, which in a standardized program is ideally uniform across all of the counties. And this guidance manual will describe in even greater detail than the resolution the eligibility requirements and application requirements of the program. So we're essentially sort of funneling downwards from the state statute to the local county resolution to the guidance manual in terms of detail in describing the program and in describing the transactions and projects themselves. All right, so now that we've touched on the documents, and we are going to circle back to the documents again, I'd like to zoom back out and talk about the program structure of the Oklahoma CPACE program. So as we've discussed, INCOG has stepped forward to sponsor this program as a public benefit that they're offering to counties all across Oklahoma, not only the counties that are typically considered a part of their footprint. And as program sponsor, they've raised funds to design, to hire consultants such as PFS to design these program documents and create all of the templates that are needed in order to operationalize this program. The creation of those documents, that program administrative platform, is what on this slide here is referred to as the Oklahoma CPACE program. So then we see that each county would therefore adopt the program, and then capital providers and property owners within each county would operate as part of the program. So let's just dig into this in a little bit of detail. So as program sponsor, INCOG is the convener of the Oklahoma CPACE program. They are leading the design of a uniform, standardized program that can be easily adopted by counties across the state. They are doing this by working with a large group of stakeholders, a steering committee, and also soliciting the feedback of the broader public on the design of this program. That's the primary method by which we're ensuring that this program will suit the needs of a broad array of Oklahomans. By creating a standardized Oklahoma CPACE program, they're establishing a single point of program administration, including project compliance review and the coordination of closings to reduce the operating burden on counties and to lower the cost of for participants. So essentially all that is to say that INCOG is designing all of the documents that will be required in order to establish a CPACE program, and they're willing to facilitate the administrative services required as part of that program as needed or as requested by local governments. Now, the Oklahoma CPACE program itself is the suite of standard documents that are being designed by INCOG and its partners. As we've discussed, this is going to include a guidance manual, an application checklist, and other standard forms. Now, any county will be able to adopt this program and adopt the usage of all of these documents, meaning that they don't need to design the documents themselves. And they will do so by adopting a resolution to establish CPACE within their jurisdiction. Counties will also, as we've discussed, be responsible for executing the assessment contracts for individual transactions and levying the assessments on individual properties. Then capital providers within the program are, of course, those that will be providing the financing for individual projects. They'll be underwriting those properties. They are the ones that will be billing and collecting the CPACE assessments directly, and they will also be enforcing these assessments in case of delinquency. And then the property owners, of course, are the applicants of CPACE financing that will be developing the project with their team and submitting the applications for financing and making annual payments on these assessments to the capital provider. For each individual transaction, the county, the capital provider, and the property owner will enter into an assessment that describes these individual roles of each partner in these transactions. So this assessment contract, once more, will define that billing, collection, and enforcement is undertaken by the capital provider, but that the county is levying the assessment on the property. So where are we in this design process? Like I said, the requisite amendment to the state statute has already been passed. We are now in the midst of, we've actually already drafted a first draft of the guidance manual, and we are hosting this webinar series in order to solicit feedback on the program and the design of the program. After this webinar series is complete, we are going to be making tweaks to this draft guidance manual based on initial feedback taken over the course of the webinar series. And then we will formally publish the full draft guidance manual and share it with those stakeholders that are interested in providing comment. And after, waiting a certain period of time to collect that comment, we will incorporate that feedback and publish the final version of the guidance manual alongside all of the other program documents that are required. That should take place. We should be collecting feedback from stakeholders sometime in the middle of this summer, and we hope to be publishing all of those documents by the end of this summer. That means that the program can begin intaking applications, or counties can begin considering applications and enacting enabling resolutions in Q3 of this year. We've already heard that there are a number of property owners that would like to access CPACE financing in Oklahoma as soon as possible. And so we are working as quickly as we can, while also taking the time to get the expected feedback from the public to develop this program and have it ready for counties to implement and property owners to take advantage of as soon as possible. All right, so I promised we were going to talk more about the guidance manual, and this is it. Like I said, since we are going to be publishing the guidance manual for public comment. At this point, I'd like to give you an overview of what type of information you should expect to see in that manual. The first thing is that we're going to define what eligible properties are and eligible applicants for financing. So the applicant for financing must be the legal owner of the property, they must be solvent, there should be no pending bankruptcy proceedings against them, and they shouldn't be a party to any pending litigation. The properties themselves must be placed on the tax rolls so that we can functionally levy an assessment. They must be current on their taxes when they apply for financing, and there should be no involuntary liens on the property. The intent of this program is to be as flexible as possible when it comes to what types of properties are eligible. We therefore do intend for all forms of commercial properties to be eligible for financing, including industrial and manufacturing and agricultural spaces, also including institutions and nonprofit organizations, and religious centers. Really the primary prohibition here is that CPACE financing is not available to residential homeowners. Now, what are the eligible improvements? As I stated at the very beginning of the call, CPACE financing has a specific intent, and that specific intent is to improve the energy efficiency, water efficiency, or resiliency of a given building. There are 4 specific buckets of improvements that are considered under the Oklahoma CPACE law. These quote-unquote buckets are building resiliency, water conservation, energy sources, and energy efficiency. And as part of this program design process, we're working to define precisely what those buckets encompass. The examples of eligible improvements that you see listed here on my slides, for those of you in front of your computer, are simply examples. And this is actually one of the main portions of the guidance manual where we would love to receive public feedback on the types of projects that would be beneficial in Oklahoma. To be clear, however, these programs are not prescriptive in terms of the types of projects that are eligible. So it's not going to be, you will not actually see in the guidance manual this explicit list of measures. What you will rather see is a definition describing the intent of how we determine eligibility. That intent is based on the fact that improvements must be permanently affixed to the property, that financing terms shall not exceed the expected life of the proposed improvements, and that those improvements are indeed improvements. Therefore, we are in some way making the building more resilient, more water efficient, more energy efficient than it had previously been. One thing I'd also like to say here is, because of the way that we speak about these improvements, a lot of folks will often think that CPACE financing can only be used for retrofits. That's not the case. CPACE financing can actually be used for new construction projects as well. What that means is that we need a baseline that these improvements should be compared against in order to determine that they're eligible for financing. And one of the things that we're working on as part of this program design process is identifying what an appropriate baseline for new construction properties would be. But so that's the philosophy around those of us who design CPACE programs and those of us who administer CPACE programs think about project eligibility. The last thing I will say here is that we do expect for CPACE what's called retroactive CPACE financing. to be available. What that essentially means is, refers to is CPACE being used as a form of refinancing of previously completed projects. All right, and then the last thing I'll touch on here are the sample application requirements. So when a property owner applies for CPACE financing, what is required to demonstrate that a property owner is, and a project is eligible for financing, is the submission of a CPACE application package. And that package is going to involve some form of cover sheet, providing the basic information about the property, but it is also going to require a number of other documents in order to demonstrate that this project is a CPACE project and eligible for financing under the state statute and under local resolution. So the types of information that a reviewer of a CPACE application is looking for is information about the property details, right? So of course, what is the address of the property? What type of property is it? What is the property's parcel number? Who's the legal owner of the property? Is that legal owner of the property the entity or the individual that's actually applying for financing? So we're going to be looking at things like title reports and property cards. Then there are questions around eligibility. So is the property current on tax payments? Are there any outstanding mortgages on the property? Other outstanding liens? One thing that's unique about CPACE financing is that it requires existing mortgage lenders to provide consent for the CPACE assessment to be levied on the property. And so if there are outstanding mortgages on the property, we will need to receive a lender consent form from each of those mortgage holders. So that, for example, would be another component of the application for CPACE financing. And then we're going to be looking at project scope. And I apologize, I keep saying we because PFS does administer programs in Maryland. So I'm just very accustomed to reviewing these myself. But whomever the project reviewer is going to be, whether that's someone located in county government or whether it's a third service provider that has been contracted by the local government, that reviewer is going to look at the project scope. And the project scope is very, very important because this is what is used to understand whether the improvements that are being financed are actually eligible improvements. Are they actually improving the efficiency of this property in some way or making the building more efficient? Again, this is a section of the program that we are still in the midst of designing and determining what is the most appropriate expectation for a program in Oklahoma. However, the standard for CPACE programs across the country is for some form of analysis to be submitted. Now, whether that's a project analysis, an energy audit, or something else can vary, but some technical analysis will need to be submitted, and then that technical analysis will need to be reviewed by some form of qualified engineer that's a third party to the project, right? And that reviewer could be a member of the, a member of county government. It could be a member of the program administrator's staff if there's a explicit program administrator. It could be simply a third party that project applicants are required to hire to review that document. But the point is that there will be some form of third-party technical review of this technical application. So that's the portion of the application that helps us determine the eligibility of the project scope and of the improvements that are being financed. And then finally, the main set of information that a reviewer is going to look at is the actual terms of financing, right? So what is the assessment amount? What are the project costs that have been included in the calculation of that, the closing fees, other fees, what's the assessment term, etc. So we promised this would be more of a workshop webinar than just me talking at all of you for an hour. So thank you for putting up with me for 50 minutes so far, but we've left a lot of time for Q&A, and my colleague Genevieve Sherman is going to be managing either reading off questions from the chat or unmuting those of you that have raised your hands using the raise hand function. So we'll now open it up to Q&A.
Great. Can you all hear me? Jess, is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. A lot of you have been writing in questions, and so I will probably start by just reading those off. As she said, as a participant, you can raise your hand. And Jessa, I actually haven't seen anyone raise their hand, and I'm just wanting to make sure that that function is working. Okay, thank you. Chris Wilson just raised his hand. So Chris, I appreciate that. Now I know that the technology is working. So, you know, ideally, folks, all of us would be around a table today, and we would all be able to meet one another and learn a little bit about where each of us come from, what section of the industry. I can tell you that there are folks around this virtual table today from local government in Oklahoma. We have folks that are on the sort of energy efficiency and renewable energy consulting side, folks from local utilities, from real estate. There are capital providers on this call. So what I would encourage you to do is I'm going to start with some of the written questions. When you write in questions, try not to write them in as an anonymous attendee, although you're welcome to if you prefer to do that. And then I'm going to flip over to the raising hands. And when I call on you, please introduce yourself to everyone on the call. Just name, where you work, what you do. And then we really welcome your questions and comments. And we've got about 35 minutes to have sort of an open conversation about this. And we're looking forward to getting your initial feedback. All right, very good. So Jessa, I'm just going to start back at some of the questions that were asked a little bit earlier in the process. There were a couple of questions about how this program works alongside other incentive programs, for example, lighting or heat pump rebates through local electric companies, et cetera, tax credits for solar. Can you speak a little bit about how CPACE works alongside other existing incentive programs for property owners?
Yeah, absolutely. CPACE as a financing mechanism is what we refer to in the industry as stackable. And what we mean by that is that you can access it alongside any other form of grant, rebate, incentive, or other form of financing that you might wish to access. There are almost no prohibitions against using CPACE alongside other forms of financing. But specifically when it comes to rebates and grants and other incentive programs offered by utilities, you can absolutely use CPACE and access those programs at the same time. What that means, for example, is if you're a small business owner and you're applying for $200,000 of CPACE financing to fund the total cost of efficiency upgrades to your property, but you are also eligible to apply for a $2,000 rebate from your utility because of the types of measures that you are installing, you are more than able to apply for that full $200,000 of financing and then apply for the $2,000 rebate and actually pocket the rebate to use for something else. So in that sense, the money is fungible. You'd also be able to deduct the $2,000 from the total financing and apply for only $198,000 of financing. So that's entirely on you, the applicant, to determine what you want to do in those situations. And in fact, again, Maryland is such an easy example for me because I've been administering it for several years now. But we work with our utility partners in Maryland as an administrator, and I will actually go to their trainings for their contractors and train them about CPACE as a program that's offered throughout the state that they can offer to their clients when they're offering their other utility incentive programs to those clients. So we have a very close partnership there in the state, and that's a very sort of natural partnership for there to be.
Great. Thanks, Jessa. So we had a question from Jared Cooper early in the presentation that was then repeated by a couple folks anonymously later in the program, which is, will there be like maximum amounts of financing you can put on the property? There are some concerns that there will be a not to exceed amount for a loan on a building, as well as limitations on minimum loan sizes. Can you what we're anticipating that will look like in the guidance manual?
Yeah. So one thing I want to stress is just how flexible CPACE financing is. CPACE financing, where we operate as an administrator, has been used to finance projects from as small as $100,000 to as large as $2 million. And we actually have some projects in the pipeline now that are in the tens of millions of dollars. And there have been CPACE projects elsewhere in the country that have been in the tens of millions of dollars, even in the 20s of millions of dollars. So the size of projects in general can be very flexible according to your needs as an applicant. Now, whether there is any sort of maximum based upon the actual value of the property or based upon the full expected cost of the project, that is not currently being contemplated by the program at this time. That is sometimes required in other programs. For example, a loan to value maximum, value referring to the value of the property, or a total debt to value maximum, you will almost always see some sort of requirements there from the actual capital providers based upon their underwriting standards, and different capital providers will probably have different thresholds, right? Whether that's a 25% or a 30 or a 35% threshold. But at a programmatic level, we expect to leave those types of decisions up to the private market, that is up to the capital providers. So as I stated before, from a programmatic level, you as an applicant will be eligible to receive up to 100% of all hard and soft costs associated with eligible improvements to the property, period. So if your project is expected to cost $4 million, inclusive of financing fees and closing costs, etc., and all of the measures that are being financed through those $4 million are considered eligible improvements under the program, then you will be able to apply for $4 million of financing. There will not be a maximum threshold on that from a programmatic level. In terms of minimum requirements, that is, again, something that's still being discussed. And again, it is commonly some sort of requirement that you see in most programs. However, in my experience, most of the minimums in programs across the country, you never actually see projects that are that small. So in Virginia, for example, the minimum project size is $50,000. But as I stated previously, our the smallest project that we've had in Maryland has been $100,000, and that pretty much tracks nationwide. You don't usually see projects that are smaller than $100,000. You don't often see projects that are smaller than $150,000. The reason for that being is that capital providers are charging a closing fee that is calculated as a percentage of the total project cost or the total financed amount, right? And so for them, for a project that is $100,000, compared to a project that is $1 million, the effort that they're expending in terms of employee resources and time is going to be approximately the same for those two projects, but they're not making nearly as much off of that $100,000 project. And so that being the case, most property owners are just typically not going to see CPACE financing as a solution for projects smaller than that size, not unless you have a sort of local specialty lender that is focused on, projects that are maybe 100,000 and below. So,
Great.
yeah.
Great. Yeah. Sorry. There are lots of questions coming in.
Yeah.
So I'm going to fire a couple more at you. So
Sure.
I think the upshot there is we don't anticipate really there being maximum or minimum loan requirements as part of this guidance manual, but capital providers, when they underwrite these loans and the value of properties, may have their own criteria on a project by project basis for how much PACE financing is appropriate, or at least from their perspective, what they're willing to lend against the property.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just sticking on the theme of eligibility, I'm going to try to group these questions.
Yeah.
There's a question. This was, I think maybe, I don't know, I think early in the program, people couldn't submit questions under their names. This is also anonymous, but saying that the Oklahoma CPACE statute doesn't include any kind of minimum energy savings requirement, such as a savings to investment ratio. Can we speak a little bit about how we're thinking about what will be in the guidance manual and the resolution by way of criteria for determining or demonstrating eligible improvements?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Genevieve, I think you've thought about this a bit more than I have, so I'll let you
Sure.
jump in if you'd like, but I would reiterate what I said previously about the fact that at this time we are still looking at what those technical analysis requirements are going to be. However, the standard is certainly that some form of technical analysis is going to be submitted and that some qualified third party is going to be required to review that technical analysis. But from there, I'll let you share your thoughts as well, Genevieve.
Sure. It may be, I don't know who asked that question, but it may be interesting for folks to know that there were some pilot projects done under this program last year in Tulsa County. And as part of the resolution that was adopted by Tulsa County, there was, a sort of some basic language included in that resolution with respect to how a property would be determined to be an energy efficient or a water conservation improvement. what constitutes an improvement on real property. And the place that they landed is that there needs to be some kind of baseline against which efficiency is compared against, or resiliency is compared against. So the resolution that is in Tulsa County at the moment, which is fairly simple, is that if it's an existing building, there needs to be improvements made to that building. So any improvements that are energy efficient compared to its previous condition, that improve the water efficiency compared to its previous condition, its resiliency, and then of course any installation of a resource on that property. And for new construction, it would really be anything that is an improvement over and above the minimum building codes for Tulsa County. So that may help give you an idea of what that kind of baseline would look like, and what you would need to do just in terms of basic demonstration of efficiency, whether it's on the specifications of the equipment or actual projected savings. Is what Jessa is saying. That's still being determined, but at minimum there needs to be a baseline against which efficiency can be determined. All right, and I'm just searching for any other eligibility ones. We don't see any. So Jessa, there were a couple of questions, one from Eric Pollard, and one from, okay, also anonymous, but it's the same question, which is, can you explain a typical application process in terms of how long does it take beginning to end to review and approve a CPACE application?
Excuse me. Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing that I think is important is for you all, as you're thinking about these projects, to bifurcate the project development process and the actual project review and approval process. In most instances, CPACE financing is being used as a component of a complicated real estate transaction. And those transactions, those projects rather, to develop can often take months at a time. But that is not an outcome of CPACE being a part of those projects. And I would not incorporate the consideration of that period of time in answering your question, Eric, and to the other individual who asked this question. So to answer your question, I would say once the project has been completely developed, because we don't know how long that can take, but once it has been developed and an application has been submitted to the reviewer of that application, I would say it would probably take not more than 10 business days for the reviewer to review and approve that application. I think 10 business days is a very common standard in a lot of CPACE markets. We, in our markets, will typically review and approve an application within 3 business days, so it can be done more quickly. It's all going to depend on who is actually reviewing the applications. So that is a bit TBD. But I think longer, I don't think you would see longer than 10 days. Once the application has been approved, the project can then immediately move into the closing phase. And from that point, all of the financing documents, including the assessment contract, are going to be executed by the project parties. And the assessment contract is going to be recorded in the land records. And it's at the point at which the document is recorded, the assessment contract, and has been evidenced in the land records, that capital providers often feel comfortable dispersing funds. And so I would say that whole closing process plus recording the assessment contract in the land records usually takes about a week to a week and a half. So I think, to sum it up, from the point of submission of an application to the point of dispersal, I think you can look on average at that going as quote as quickly as 2 weeks, but probably not longer than a month.
Great. Thanks, Jessa. Yeah, and I'll emphasize that in some ways it really depends on the applicant, and what you all can expect to see in this guidance manual, as Jessa mentioned several times, is an application checklist. The purpose of that is to make the application process in Oklahoma both streamlined and as efficient as possible, so that that review can happen very quickly, and that it doesn't require a lot of subjective decision making or back and forth between the reviewer and the applicant. So when applications are completed and everything is in there, and it's quite clear who is the property owner, that they do in fact own the property, that the taxes have been paid, that's all evidenced on a title report. They have the consent of any lender that is secured against the property, that they've described the measures that are going into the building, that those have been, qualified by an engineer. It can go pretty quickly. So it's always a two-way street, how sort of complete an application is and how long it takes to review. But I certainly agree with Jessa that, anywhere between 3 and 10 business days is relatively standard. Jessa, there also were questions with respect to the administrative process on fees. We had a couple of folks ask early just kind of what are typical fees in the program, and they were asking about all third-party fees. So maybe if you can speak to sort of what sort of fees and closing costs tend to look like for a property owner.
Yeah. So there's a few primary fees / closing costs that stand out to me that are going to be specific to CPACE, right? As opposed to another form of financing. Obviously, the capital provider is going to charge some sort of closing fee, as with any other loan. In addition to the capital provider charging a closing fee, there will typically be some sort of closing fee that is charged by the reviewer of the application, so associated with the work for administering the program. There will sometimes, but not always, be a separate minimal fee that is charged by the county. And then there will sometimes be recordation taxes, though I do believe that in the course of the 2 pilot projects that were executed in Tulsa County, that a recordation tax was not charged. But please don't quote me on that. And anyway, that is something that could even vary county to county.
Great. And Jessa, we actually also had a question, a sort of a follow-up question on that from Commissioner Antle. I apologize, Commissioner, if I just mispronounced your last name, from Washington County in Oklahoma, about how those fees are actually paid for, particularly if the county brings on a third-party administrator. Are they charged, are they paid in cash? Are they financed and capitalized into the assessment? How are they passed through to the property owner?
Yeah, well, so that's the beauty of CPACE for local governments, is that local governments are not expected to expend their own resources, their own time and funds on this program. And almost all local governments nationwide that have CPACE programs have contracted some third party to provide some or all of these services associated with administering these programs. And those third parties, in this case, I'm just going to call it a third party administrator. That third party administrator is always paid through through financing fees. So as I just stated previously, talking about fees, one of the fees that you always see is a closing fee that is a percentage of the financed amount or of the project cost that is paid to the reviewer of the application, or in this case, the program administrator. And so they would be paid through that directly by the property owner as a cost of financing. The county would not be expected to make any payments to the program administrator or any other third-party servicers that they're working with to administer this program.
Great, thank you. And I'll just emphasize for folks again that the guidance manual and documents that are being developed through this process, I also applaud INCOG and their steering committee and others that have financially supported this effort. A lot of the lift on getting all this stuff developed is just, time and writing documents and legal counsel, and their effort here to design the program will really help to defray future costs with respect to actually operating a program. So in the guidance manual that is developed for the Oklahoma PACE program, for counties that elect to adopt this program just kind of right off the shelf and utilize an administrative service through INCOG, those estimated fees will be published in the guidance manual. And we expect them to be on, the low end of CPACE programs around the country. Capital provider fees are typically disclosed on a per project basis, right? So that's something that a property owner would negotiate directly. And any of the other third-party fees that Jessa did not mention, like engineering costs, et cetera, we anticipate that to be completely open market. So, property owners will have full choice in what engineers they choose to work with, what capital providers they choose to work with, et cetera. So obviously those are additional costs of developing a project, but those are determined by the property owner, and they can also be financed as part of the CPACE financing. Okay, I'm just looking for anything else on administrative process. There was a question asked early about what documents capital providers, mortgage lenders, and property owners can use in this program. And Jessa, I can just take this one.
Sure.
The question is, how do complex multi-million-dollar CPACE projects kind of operate within the contours of standardized documents? So this is a great question. What I would say is that the assessment contract, the sort of template assessment contract that we are helping to draft as part of the Oklahoma CPACE program, is really meant to be a summary document, which can be recorded on property records, that primarily summarizes the roles and responsibilities of the county, the property owner, and the capital provider, vis-a-vis the billing, collection, and enforcement of delinquent CPACE assessments. And all of those roles and responsibilities are described in statute. So it will sort of be parroting those responsibilities. And it's meant to sort of contractually bind the parties to their statutory obligations, and for the assessment itself and the schedule of assessment payments to be evidenced on land records. But capital providers and property owners may choose to, and likely will, enter into a separate financing agreement that describes in a much greater detail the contractual arrangement between those two parties. And that could include, many other, covenants or representations, or, the conditions under which a capital provider will disperse funds to the property owner. Funds may need to be escrowed with a senior lender who is also providing funds into a project. So our vision for this program should provide all the flexibility for a capital provider, a property owner, and a senior lender to customize their own documentation around a transaction. The purpose of the assessment contract, which is called for under the state statute, is for there to be a basic and uniform document that evidences the existence of a CPACE assessment on any property anywhere in the state of Oklahoma, which is consistent, with what folks would expect from operating either as a property owner, a lender, or a contractor in other states in the country. Okay, I'm just checking any other written questions. I think we did get to all of them. So we have another couple of minutes, and I really would invite anyone to raise their hand with additional questions or comments. They don't have to be questions at all. They can just be statements. Any at all. Please don't be shy.
I'd be glad to hear a voice other than mine. I'm sure you all would too.
Okay, great. I am going to call on Roy. Roy, you should, hold on one moment. Okay, you should be able to speak now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi Roy.
Okay, perfect. I just had a question as a new solar company in Tulsa County. I've had a few quotes that I sent out to some commercial places that they've kind of put their projects on hold for now, just because of the upfront costs of an installation. So with the CPACE program, I believe one of them is a city building. The other one is a cannabis grower. Would that be something that they will be able to access once we get everything finalized?
So city property, and Jessa, please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe are unfortunately not eligible in the program under statute. So the property has to be a commercial property. And in addition to that, there's actually some zoning restrictions as well.
Okay.
So I'll pause there, Jessa, in case you disagree.
No, that's correct.
Okay. With respect to cannabis, certainly if the property is commercially owned, there is not a statutory prohibition against that in the PACE law. As you may know, cannabis is a very niche lending area. So I think, there would need to be a capital provider that was interested in funding that property. But with respect to the CPACE statute, there's nothing written about cannabis in particular. It would be, I imagine, just considered an agricultural or a commercial property.
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. That's all I had.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Roy. Other questions or comments?
I think another question popped up, Genevieve, in the Q&A.
Okay, great. Let's go down here. Okay, so the question is, how easily can property owners add on to financing in a future year? So for example, if a property owner closes on a CPACE assessment this year, can they do it, next year?
Yeah, you can have multiple assessments on your property. The only thing to keep in mind, however, is that if you were to add on in a future year, if the project has already closed and all of the the closing documents have been executed, then that would be considered a completely separate project. So you would have to go through the entire application process again.
Great. Oh, and actually, Jessa, I'm realizing I did miss a question from Eric Pollard here at the bottom. He asked, what happens if the useful life of the equipment is shorter than the term of the loan?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that this program is being developed, and this is the industry standard nationwide, is that the term of financing cannot exceed 30 years or the expected useful life of the measures being financed, whichever is shorter. So if the expected useful life is 25 years, then you would only be able to access a 25-year term for your financing. And if there are multiple measures that are being financed through the same project, then the expected useful life would be considered, I believe this is in the guidance manual, would be considered the longest, the expected useful life of the measure with the longest expected useful life, right? So if you were financing two measures and one's expected useful life was 20 years and the other's was 25 years, then for the purposes of that project, 25 years would be the expected useful life of the project, and therefore your financing would have to stop at 25 years.
Great. And for Eric or any of those of you on the webinar that are not familiar with this aspect of commercial PACE, because commercial PACE loans are legally placed on the property as an annual assessment, a benefit assessment that's levied, the assessment transfers with the ownership of the property. So the property can be sold at any time, and unless that assessment obligation is voluntarily prepaid, and it may be voluntarily prepaid, then the assessment obligation would transfer to the future owner as well. So just like any other special assessments for public improvements to real property, for example, if a municipality or a county were building, a wastewater treatment facility or a sewer district or what have you, you would not want there to be an encumbrance on a property for a benefit that is not there, right? So an easy example is if a property owner is installing LED lights that last for 15 years, you wouldn't want to place a 30-year encumbrance on the property because that benefit really is not going to be there for 30 years. So that's the logic there. Okay, we do have one more hand raised, so I can't help but not call to hear new voices. Let's see here, Scott Lambert, you should be able to join us now.
Okay, yeah, thank you for everything you guys are doing. I appreciate this. I have a project down in Cleveland County that we're going to be in the design process, and I'm afraid I'm getting, this program is fantastic, by the way, but I want to know, how do I access, what do I do during this process between now and November if we're in the design process? Do you have any advice for people that are going full steam ahead to really start construction early, first quarter next year? What any advice we should be doing right now?
Great question. And actually, Jessa, Scott's question is reminding me that there also was a written one that I missed, which was about how will property owners link up with capital providers and contractors. There was a question about whether project applications would come in to the program and then be bid out, or whether that would be a different process. So maybe you can answer both of those questions in one go.
Yeah. So in terms of developing an application for CPACE financing, the first step for a property owner or someone who's working with a property owner is really to connect with your financier for CPACE. Most of those, well, all of those companies that offer CPACE financing are offering CPACE financing nationwide. They're very familiar with how these projects are developed and what applications are typically expected to include. And so if you have connected with a CPACE capital provider, then they are going to be able to help you compile all of the parts of the application that would be standard, and then work with us as we design the program to compile the other parts of the application that are required as we sort of finalize certain aspects of these application requirements. So there is definitely work that can be begun, that can be going on in tandem with us finishing up the design process. In terms of how you connect with a capital provider, this program will not run any sort of bid program. As we stated, this is intended to be an open market program, so property owners can work with any capital provider that they wish. Most capital providers of CPACE financing are specialty lenders. Not many traditional commercial banks offer CPACE financing. And if you have a project and have not yet connected with a capital provider, then I would recommend that you reach out to Adrian and myself. And I think we can probably provide you with a list of most of the CPACE capital providers nationwide for the time being. In the future, there will be an actual list of registered capital providers associated with this program that you'll be able to select from, and we'll hopefully get to that point pretty, soon, or sometime later this summer. If you have a project already, and particularly if you have identified a capital provider, then I would encourage you as your next step, again, to reach out to Adrian and I, so that we can determine whether we have already interfaced with the county where your project is located, because the county is a very, very important part of this process. They're critical to establishing these programs. If the county where your property is located is not on board with the program, then unfortunately you're not going to be able to access the financing. And as I stated, we have already started to have conversations with a number of counties in Oklahoma. So I would ask that you please reach out to us first before approaching the county directly. And then we can figure out together how to go from there.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So thank you, Scott, for that question. And there were a couple more that came in just at the end here, but we are at the end of our time. So I wanted to, that was a good segue, Jessa, with respect to counties, to just maybe remind folks of the last webinar here. And then I'll just remind folks as well that, everyone's contact information obviously was on these slides, and anyone who registered for this webinar will receive, I believe, a link to the recording. So you'll be able to remember how to get in touch with Jessa and with Adrian. The very beginning of this, there also was a link to the website for the program right now, which has information about all these webinars, and to stay engaged with us so that when these documents are posted, for those of you that had input you wanted to make or comments you want to make upon receiving and reviewing them, that we do get those. So I'll just leave my piece here with a thanks to all of you for attending today and for getting engaged in the process.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So as you see on your screen, we will have one final webinar in this series. This webinar is targeted at representatives of local governments because it's going to detail precisely what those local governments' roles and responsibilities are regarding the program. So if you're not a local government, you are welcome to attend, but I wouldn't expect it to be the best use of your time. However, if you are a local government official, please do attend. We will discuss in detail a number of things that haven't been discussed in these other two webinars. So I will end on that note. And yeah, thank you all so much for making the time today. We're sorry we couldn't do this in person, but I think it's been a success so far, and there's been great turnout and support for the development of this program. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.